When food lines stretched for blocks, smart families didn't beg. They planned. They made lists, grew food, and shared meals with neighbors. Others bought perishables that were spoiled by morning. In those days, groceries decided who thrived. What if the same 7 habits that saved families in the 1930s could cut your grocery bill in half now? 3 worst. Going to the store every day slowly drained their pockets. Some families went to the store every single day. They said it kept food fresh. But what it really kept fresh was temptation. 1 extra loaf, 1 sweet for the kids, 1 nickel gone. It felt harmless, until the month ended and the cupboard still looked half empty. Shopkeepers saw it happen everywhere. In 1933, a WPA homemaker study found that daily shoppers spent about 18% more per month than families who bought weekly. Those little coins, the ones people swore didn't matter, were the reason budgets leaked like broken faucets. Housewives carried baskets, not lists. They bought with their hearts, not their math. A story from Cleveland tells it all. A mother of 3 told a reporter she ate her rent in snacks. She wasn't joking. Every evening she'd walk to the corner store for bread and come home with biscuits, jam, and gossip. By winter, her grocery tabs could have paid her coal bill twice. That was how the trap worked. Quiet, steady, familiar. It happened because the store felt safe. Daily trips gave people a sense of control when the world outside didn't. Yet it also gave them a false rhythm, more routine, less reason. When prices rose by pennies, nobody noticed. But those pennies, week after week, became weeks of hunger later. By contrast, families who shopped weekly turned shopping into planning. They made lists, compared prices, and knew exactly what to skip. When they ran out, they adapted instead of panicking. The difference was invisible day to day, but life-changing by spring. Daily shopping taught one cruel truth: discipline doesn't live in convenience. And the families who learned that soon uncovered the second trap of the Depression: trusting pretty labels more than math. 2 worst: paying extra for brands without ever checking the math. Families in the 1930s loved labels the way we love apps today. A shiny brand name felt like safety when everything else looked uncertain. Housewives trusted the big print on the box more than their own notes. National brands mean quality, ads promised. People believed it, until their budgets cracked under the weight of fancy packaging and missing math. In 1931, Procter & Gamble spent over $1 million on national radio ads, more than some states spent on school lunches. Soap, flour, canned goods, all dressed in pride. Yet the same products often came from the same factories that sold unbranded versions for half the price. A pound of Quaker oats cost 12 cents, plain bulk oats just 6. But the bulk bag didn't have the friendly face or the tune from the radio. Many families paid extra for comfort they couldn't measure, and without a written record, they couldn't see how small overpayments became big losses. The U.S. Bureau of Home Economics found that families without price books spent up to 25% more on identical groceries each year. One mother from St. Louis kept no notes until her daughter, barely 12, started tracking prices on scraps of paper. In 6 months, they saved enough for a new coal stove. However, most families didn't keep ledgers at all. They shopped on memory and habit, 2 things that vanish fast during chaos. Stores took advantage of that forgetfulness, quietly changing labels or shrinking packages. The Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company once cut the weight of its coffee tins by an ounce, but kept the price. Few noticed. What made it worse was pride. People liked saying they bought the good stuff. Brand loyalty became identity. But Depression life had no room for ego. Those who finally switched to price tracking turned that notebook into their second wallet. Because in the end, numbers kept promises that slogans never did. And just as brands drained savings quietly, perishables drained them loudly. The third costly habit waiting behind every kitchen door. One worst, buying fresh food that spoiled before the week even ended. Fresh food felt like victory in the 1930s. After weeks of bread, beans, and powdered milk, a basket of fruit or meat looked like hope itself. Families wanted that feeling, even if it didn't fit the budget. But hope rots fast. By the next morning, half of what they bought turned soft, sour, or brown, and so did their money. Refrigeration was rare luxury then. By 1935, only about 1 in 10 homes had an electric fridge. The rest relied on ice boxes, often shared among neighbors. Ice melted, food spoiled, and no one wanted to waste a block that cost a nickel. Housewives gambled between freshness and survival, buying what looked best instead of what lasted longest. Meat, milk, berries, each a small risk with a high price. Government records told the story plainly. In 1933, the U.S. Department of Agriculture estimated that American households lost nearly 12% of their grocery money to spoilage, an enormous figure when average weekly food budgets were under $5. That meant families threw away the same food they'd waited hours in line to buy. Some even tried to revive wilted produce by soaking it in vinegar or salt water overnight. It worked sometimes, but pride took the real hit. However, waste came from emotion more than ignorance. After months of hardship, a good cut of meat or fresh peaches made people feel human again. Spending on perishables was rebellion against scarcity. It was saying, we still live well. Yet the Depression punished comfort faster than it rewarded joy. By contrast, clever homemakers learned to buy shelf-stable goods, beans, flour, salt pork, and stretch them into a week's worth of meals. They bought smart, not fresh. Some even traded daily market trips for weekly bulk buys with neighbors. That shift, small but steady, separated waste from wisdom. And that wisdom grew into something greater. The rise of disciplined shopping lists, weekly price books, and grocery planning that could outlast fear itself. 4 best. Keeping a weekly list and price book saved real dollars fast. Every strong household in the 1930s had one secret weapon, a small notebook that ruled the kitchen table. It wasn't fancy or leather-bound, just a few folded pages with numbers, prices, and grocery lists. But that little book changed everything. It turned grocery shopping from guessing into strategy. Families with lists didn't just survive. They stayed steady when the market shook. The rule was simple. Write down what you need, what it costs, and what it should cost next week. Housewives compared prices between stores, tracked patterns, and spotted tricks long before inflation hit. A 1934 home economics survey showed that families keeping written price books spent up to 20% less a month on food. That was like gaining an extra week of groceries every 5 weeks without earning a cent more. One story from Indianapolis told of a widow with 3 children who carried her book folded in her apron. She knew every price: flour at 6 cents, sugar at 5 cents, coffee at 18 cents. When stores tried to slip in increases, she walked 2 blocks to another shop. "I buy from honesty," she told a reporter in 1936, not from habit. That quiet discipline gave her what many lost: control. However, the list wasn't just about math. It was about rhythm. Families shopped once a week, never daily. They planned meals around what lasted, not what tempted. Bread day, soup day, stew day, it all came from the list. The act of writing gave structure to chaos. It also turned spending into a record of resilience. Some lists became family heirlooms. Decades later, descendants still kept those notebooks, faded pages of prices, scribbles, and grocery dreams. The Depression taught that paper, pen, and planning could beat any panic. And from those lists grew another idea. Why buy alone when 10 families could buy together and pay half? The next tactic turned that logic into community power. Three Best, joining buying clubs, turned neighbors into smart suppliers. When single shoppers ran out of money, whole neighborhoods started thinking together. The 1930s buying clubs weren't charity, they were strategy. It began with a few families tossing coins on a table, pooling grocery lists, and placing one big order straight from a mill or wholesaler. $10 together bought what 20 couldn't alone. That was the secret: scale without greed. A group of Ohio mothers started one of the first in 1932. They called it the penny pile. Every Saturday, they met in a church basement, collected small bills, and wrote one order for flour, beans, sugar, and coffee. A single 100-pound sack of flour cost less per pound than 5 20-pound bags. That difference, a few cents, was survival money. By year's end, their club had saved members nearly $80 each, roughly 2 months' rent. However, buying clubs grew far beyond groceries. Some pooled to buy kerosene, sewing thread, and even shoes. The Department of Agriculture recorded over 6,000 co-ops and buying clubs nationwide by 1935, many run by women. These weren't just cost cutters. They were training grounds for financial discipline. Every member logged purchases, voted on spending, and balanced ledgers like a miniature company. The magic was trust. Members paid before receiving goods. Late payments weren't punished. They were discussed. One Iowa club even printed its own scrip, a small paper note worth a few cents, used among members when cash ran short. That little system kept food moving when banks still froze credit. These clubs became more than a fix. They became the foundation for the cooperative movement that still exists today. The modern food co-op, credit union, and farmers collective all trace roots to those Depression buying tables. And yet, even as neighbors shared bulk sacks of beans and barrels of oil, others planted a deeper safety net, one that grew right out of their backyards. 2 Best, growing food and canning jars, replaced half their groceries. When grocery shelves thinned and paychecks disappeared, Americans didn't wait for rescue. They started digging. Backyard gardens became the new savings accounts. Seeds were cheaper than fear. A packet of beans cost 5 cents and could feed a family for weeks. That simple math changed the decade. By 1934, 1 in 4 U.S. families grew part of their own food. The movement exploded when the government launched relief gardens in 1933, followed by victory gardens later in the decade. Cities like Detroit and Cleveland saw vacant lots transformed into green grids of cabbage, carrots, and corn. Families who had once lived by streetlights now worked by sunrise with hose and tin buckets. It gave people more than food. It gave them control again. A family in Illinois kept a ledger of their first garden year. They planted 400 square feet, spent $2.10 on seeds, and harvested nearly $75 worth of vegetables, more than a month's wages at the time. The numbers spread fast through word of mouth. Canning clubs then taught housewives how to store surplus, pressure cooking peas, sealing tomatoes, and lining shelves like treasure chests. However, the skill came with science. If one seal broke, the whole batch spoiled. The Department of Agriculture distributed canning bulletins and even sent mobile kitchen trucks to rural towns for training. Women filled libraries with handwritten recipes marked for hard winters. Those jars often fed families through layoffs and even births. The ripple went beyond food. Gardens cut grocery bills by up to 40%, according to a 1936 report. But more than numbers, they rewired psychology, turning helplessness into habit. Each jar sealed was one less trip to the store, one less panic about prices. And yet, even those gardens had limits. You could grow vegetables, but meat was still scarce. That's when communities found another trick, sharing the table itself. One best, sharing dinners and swap nights kept whole towns fed cheap. Money ran thin, but dinner didn't have to disappear. Across the 1930s, families invented a quiet miracle called the swap supper. It was simple. Neighbors traded meals, leftovers, or ingredients so everyone ate better for less. One week, you made stew. The next, someone brought a roast, and nobody's table went empty. What started as survival became ritual. In towns like Des Moines and Toledo, these dinners grew into potluck chains. A single dish could travel through 3 homes in 1 week. A chicken stew from one kitchen became soup stock in another, then meat pies for a third. Food wasn't wasted. It was recycled with care. Newspapers from 1934 mention women's clubs organizing monthly swap nights, where every guest brought a dish and a story. It fed both the stomach and the spirit. There was math behind the kindness. By pooling meals, families cut meat costs by up to 35%. Instead of each household buying a small cut, one family bought a whole chicken or ham, then split it. The same trick worked for milk, butter, and coffee. Housewives learned to stretch flavor with spice and trade recipes as currency. A popular saying at the time went, "You can't eat pride, but you can share pie." However, it wasn't only about food, it was about connection. In the worst years of the Depression, loneliness hit as hard as hunger. These dinners brought laughter into quiet streets. Children played, while parents compared savings and traded garden tips. It became a kind of informal economy, built on trust, not credit. By 1937, the Department of Agriculture noted community potlucks as a key social stabilizer in struggling towns. The lesson was clear: sharing multiplied value faster than hoarding ever could. And that habit, feeding each other before feeding fear, turned the kitchen table into the strongest safety net of the decade. Hard times made people smarter with food, not richer. Subscribe to keep these Depression secrets alive, because the next story from America's toughest kitchens is about to serve another lesson.